Veronica, for joining here today. I really appreciate that. If you could just go ahead and start with your name and title and background and experience for me, that would be awesome.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks, Sam, for having me today. My
Yeah,
name is Veronica Meadows. I am the Chief Strategy Officer for the Council of Landscape Architectural Registration Boards. And to make that a little easier, we can just say CLARB because that is a
gotcha.
mouthful. I've been with the organization for quite some time, 24 years, so I'm very familiar with the regulatory community and the landscape. Through my relationship at CLARB, I have, been fortunate enough to be exposed to not only the landscape architecture regulatory community, but other related design disciplines as well, and quite frankly, across the entire regulatory community. So, yeah, I'm happy to be
Awesome.
here and happy to share what I know about what's happening in the environment.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about this coalition or organization. I refer to it as ARPL, but for those who don't know, it's the Alliance for Responsible Professional Licensing. Can you talk a little bit about that organization, mission of the organization, and how you got connected with them?
Sure, absolutely. So first and foremost, just want to share that CLARB is a founding member of the Alliance for Responsible Professional Licensing, ARPL.
Gotcha.
ARPL is a national coalition of responsible licensing advocates. We're composed of professional and regulatory associations that represent highly complex technical professions, including architecture, landscape architecture, engineering and surveying, and accountancy. The professions that we represent are all licensed in 50 plus US states and territories. And we all have established uniform standards for licensing, education, examination, and experience, and proven national mobility models for the professions that we are engaged with. ARPL promotes a responsible, balanced approach to professional licensing. And our purpose really is to educate policymakers and the public on the importance of protecting licensing for professionals or professions that have, high public impact. We also work to develop and provide best practices and practical solutions to help states solve occupation specific licensing challenges.
That's great. Awesome. Um, so one of the questions I had is how can people get involved? I mean, I know from the regulatory side, you guys can become a member of this organization. Can normal people, can people from vendors like me get involved? I mean, how do you get involved in this coalition?
Well,
Is this through
I
membership opportunities or?
well, not necessarily in ARPL, but what I would say is where practitioners or members of the public have an opportunity to get involved is really through their locality. So if you are a licensed landscape architect or engineer, serve on your local licensure board. That is and even members of the public can serve on licensing boards. And if you'd asked me 24 years ago what a licensing board was, or that one existed out there, to serve my interests, I wouldn't have known that. So I think we have a long way to go to help the general public better understand, kind of the vital role that licensing boards play. But there are opportunities to serve on these boards as a subject matter expert in a particular field or as a member of the public. The other way professionals can really get involved is, through their local professional society that represents the profession that they belong to. And in terms of, being engaged in ARPL, being aware, paying attention, ARPL has lots of information out there available on
Yes.
our website at responsiblelicensing.org. You can also find us at the ARPL on Twitter or X, LinkedIn, and Facebook.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that's a perfect segue because that's how I came across you guys as I was just surfing the web and because I'm in the space, I'm interested in a lot of these stories and what's going on in the landscape. And I came across this this study that you guys did, and it really caught my attention. So I kind of want to talk about that. And what I'm referring to is on your guys' website. Um, It looks like you conducted a study, looks like it was back in July 24th of 2023, that examined and looked at how lowering licensing standards raises business risks. And so that really caught my attention because, I work with regulators and agencies and boards and departments, and I'm kind of on the tech side of it, and so I'm helping
Mhm.
them implement this type of stuff, and so I have exposure to it, but I thought it was really interesting that the study that you guys conducted is actually there's support from the business community for really not lowering licensing standards and actually keeping those intact and making sure they're in place and serve the public as you mentioned earlier. So could you talk a little bit about that study and how did it come about? How was it conducted? Just a little bit of background.
Yeah, sure. So ARPL commissioned the Venison Strategy Group to survey, I think, about 600 decision makers for small and mid-sized businesses about the impact of, professional licensing on their businesses. And I mean, it was really quite clear that businesses overwhelmingly support responsible licensing standards. The people we spoke to are business owners that employ architects, landscape
Hmm.
architects, engineers, and then also the business owners that contract with these professionals. And what we found is that those that rely on highly complex and technical professions need assurance that their employees are qualified and competent. So, for example, 92% of business owners say that it's important to require, a license to practice for professions like accounting, engineering, architecture, landscape architecture, surveying. 90% of them said that professional licensing protects their customers and the public from receiving substandard work. Um, Business owners also agree that professional licensing helps them hire qualified professionals and build strong business reputations. 90% said, it protects, enhances their reputation. 92% said, licensing helps them assess qualifications
Hmm.
accurately in making hiring decisions.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so I just want to be clear for those who are listening. So when we talk about the standards, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what we're specifically talking about, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, are your educational requirements, maybe certifications that you hold, maybe study hours, hours in the field, things like that. We work with a couple different dentistry boards, accountancy boards, and there are certain requirements in place to make sure that that person is qualified to do what they're saying, and that can be many different areas, education and stuff like that. And so that's what we're talking about here, right? Is making sure those individuals are qualified for whatever the requirements may be,
Yeah.
for that specific practice, or we call it occupational licensing, um, for whatever their specific job function is. Just making sure that those people have the right qualifications and keeping that standard high as we've talked about. So just to
Yeah.
just
Well, yes. The short answer is yes. We are talking about the standards for education, experience, and examination, and ensuring that those standards are, rigorous enough to ensure public protection, but also, have the built-in flexibility to be equitable and accessible for practitioners entering the profession. But yes, public safety is the utmost outcome that licensing, is really put in place to ensure. And that is done through, ensuring that individuals have the adequate educational background, they've gained experience in that area, and that they've demonstrated competency through, a professional licensing exam that says, I
Mhm.
have the level of qualification that ensures that I can practice without endangering the public.
Gotcha. And a lot of those those standards will sometimes come from third parties, if I understand that correctly, too. Some of them will be directly administered by the board or by the agency, but sometimes it's also, I know for the Board of Accountancy, they have to pass a national exam, right? And it's kind of combining third party, whether it be exam issuers or other third-party national organizations. So it can kind of be from within the board and agency, but also national practice and standards as well, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, I think for all of the ARPL professions, there is a standard, nationally recognized licensing exam. So
gotcha.
you can be assured that, the person who tested, for their landscape architecture license in California took the same exam and had to meet the same, exam standard as someone who took the test and became licensed in Florida.
Yep,
That is a national exam standard for sure.
gotcha. So yeah, that leads me to my next question. What are some of the current trends that you're seeing in the regulatory space, as far as these standards? I've heard terms thrown around like universal licensing, joint compact, statewide contracts. How do you see those type of things fitting into this? Um, do you see that as kind of keeping the bar high, or is universal licensing, could that be seen as a threat, or making it too large, or too wide in scope to ensure standards? Are you familiar with some of those?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I am, and universal licensing is a very nuanced policy approach,
Hmm.
and it definitely has some considerations that we would urge policymakers to really think about before making policy decisions that might actually have unintended consequences. I mean, unfortunately, what we're seeing is very broad brushed policies
Yeah.
that are designed to kind of make to design wholesale solutions that don't
Hmm.
necessarily consider the nuances of each licensed profession. You mentioned universal licensure, which really attempts to reduce barriers to mobility,
Yeah.
which is a good thing, and we support that. However, this particular trend in reform policy doesn't take into account that some professions already have national reciprocity models. So they,
Hmm.
when they implement these policies, they risk complicating those already kind of systems in place that are working, which confuses reciprocal acts, applicants and causes unintended consequences to the public. Universal
Yes.
licensure kind of reduces the authority of individual licensing boards. It imposes a requirement that a board shall issue a reciprocal licensing through statute changes instead of leaving the discretion to the board. It really doesn't differentiate between occupations and professions. And some states passed, forms of universal licensing, which include residency requirements, which quite frankly, makes the pathway more cumbersome than, the existing models that are in place. And then in other places, universal licensing language, relied on substantially equivalency, between states and effectively
Hmm.
relying on the licensing boards to determine if an out-of-state applicant comes from a jurisdiction with requirements that would satisfy, the new state's requirements. But so universal licensing is one trend that we've seen. Another that we've started to see is undermining the ability for a licensure board to do what they are charged to do, which is to
Hmm.
administer and enforce licensure policies that are put in place to protect the public. Lots of review commissions stood up, mandated sunset review,
Yep.
and some of these efforts that we've seen, really are to change the composition of the board or to consolidate boards. This can unfortunately result in the reduction or elimination of the really needed subject matter expertise on boards and puts the decision making authority in hands of state employees that really, quite frankly, aren't qualified to make those decisions. And there's also been attempts to remove board authority in the complaint and disciplinary process, which,
Hmm.
that's really the public's due process should they ever be harmed
Exactly.
by a practitioner.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of some of the feedback that I'm getting internally here from some of our clients is, it really kind of complicates that landscape and can kind of muddy the waters, if you will, to make it really complicated for the board to carry out their initiatives. But then also for the public, it gets a little bit confusing when you try to implement some of these, the universal licensing and the joint compacts. And I think you touched on it perfectly. It's like in some cases, there's already um, pretty good regulations and processes around this already. And then we're trying to throw kind of these new you know, systems in place that really just kind of make it more confusing and make it more confusing for the boards. It's like,
Yeah,
oh gosh, now I have to meet these standards or requirements for something that we already had legislation in place for,
yeah,
or we
yeah,
already had standards in place for, and yeah, I think that was a great point that you mentioned, and that's what I'm hearing too.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what are um, I have to ask. So on the other side of the coin, do you get feedback, or have you heard, what's the opposition say, or what's the other side of this say? Or do you hear people say, well, gosh, we have a shortage of, teachers or police officers or, nurses, and really we need to lower the barriers of entry to get more professionals in that, it working essentially. Do you hear that type of feedback or um
Yeah,
it,
certainly. And I think workforce development and, building strong economies, from state policy standpoint is probably where they're coming from. So I think their
mhm,
intentions are good. But
mhm,
I think just not, poor understanding of the systems and processes that are in place, contributes to their attempt to solve those challenges. And I would actually argue that many of the national regulatory associations like CLARB, like, and others for other professions are looking internally and working with their own members to say, okay, we know licensure needs to maintain enough rigor to ensure public protection, but what can we do within our own systems and processes? How can we look critically at, the requirements and say, okay, how do we eliminate unnecessary friction while maintaining the rigor? And
mhm.
that often looks at, we have to look at that by saying, okay, what friction in the process doesn't have a direct public protection outcome? And if we find those things, we have a responsibility to, eliminate or reduce those things. And I think that's, something that's a lesson that we can all learn, within the regulatory community, is to look critically at our requirements, at our systems, our processes. And if there is friction there that doesn't have a direct public protection outcome, then we have to figure out how we're going to address that.
Yeah, yeah. What I think that's a great point. And can you touch on that a little bit more? Like how do you, as regulators, identify that? I mean, is it I can think of stuff from the IT side that, data analytics, stuff like that, will kind of bring that to light. But what are some of the ways that you and some of the members see, like, oh, we might have a problem here, or maybe this little portion is inefficient, or we're getting a lot of people that are having a hard time fulfilling this requirement? Is there ways that you guys have implemented to say, yeah, this is a trouble spot, or maybe we can make this better or easier for our population to adhere to this requirement?
Sure, absolutely. Now, I can only speak for Clark because
Yeah.
obviously I'm intimately
Yep.
knowledgeable about, our systems and processes. But, we went through that process a few years ago. We, surveyed and spoke with licensing boards, and we said, okay, where are you experiencing friction in the
Hmm.
process? We spoke to, individuals working, through the licensure process or had been through the licensure process and asked them where they, met
Right.
friction in the process. And we kind of took all of that information. We identified some key areas where we knew we were going to have to focus our efforts in making improvements. One was, varying requirements for licensure from state to state, because that creates confusion and
Hmm.
frustration. We knew that we were going to have to address, creating efficiencies in the time to licensure, and there were several areas where we focused our efforts. And ultimately, what we came away with was we need to ensure that our licensing requirements are defensible, that they're rooted in data that shows us that these are the right requirements, and that they're, equitable and accessible. And one of the ways that we have addressed that within the landscape architecture profession has been recognizing that there are alternative paths to licensure, and recognizing that not everyone has access to, a very expensive, 5-year bachelor's program in landscape
Hmm.
architecture, and recognizing that, our, demographics of our country is changing, and we want our profession to be representative of the communities that they help to build and support. And so for us, recognizing and valuing alternative paths to licensure, I think has been a big step forward in, licensing for landscape architects. And, we are currently working with our member jurisdictions to, revise their licensing requirements to also recognize alternative paths to licensure.
Yeah, I think that's great. And getting the direct feedback from the licensee population, I think is really important. And I think, it's getting right to the source. And I was actually surprised how few um, boards that I've talked to and agencies actually do that. Or, I can totally understand some of it maybe just be noise, or, just stuff that's not particularly helpful. But I think it's important to listen to the licensee population, and where you can find those nuggets of truth, or find the good ideas to implement those. And I think that's awesome that you guys are doing that. And I think a lot of boards and agencies could find a lot of benefit in that. It's not always easy to get that feedback. The mechanism to try to set that up and to receive good feedback can be difficult to implement. I just commend you guys on that. That sounds great. And I wish that more, and I hope that more agencies and boards do that for the licensee population, is like, what are their feedbacks? And, just by having some of the general public members be a part of the board, um,
Yeah.
is a great way too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Very
yeah,
supportive of public representation on licensing boards. It's a very necessary quality check, and check on ourselves, and very, very helpful for the public at
yeah,
large.
totally. Have you seen, can you talk a little bit about, have you seen that technology can support in that? Like, has IT been able to support any of these initiatives, with ways of adhering to standards, but then also looking at ways to maybe support the licensee population? Have you seen trends in that, or implementing some of that?
Well, I think technology's integration into the regulatory space is, a topic of significant importance and discussion.
Hmm.
I mean, we think about AI,
Yeah.
that's a logical, technology solution. Um, but, the extent to which AI should influence regulatory matters is, an issue of ongoing debate.
Yeah.
It's likely that AI can enhance the efficiency of regulatory, operations. I think we see, AI as a valuable tool that can streamline processes, But I think it's really important to acknowledge and address, the associated risks and limitations too. And I just don't think we know enough about it yet. But there is a cautious and thoughtful approach to implementation of, technology and specifically AI in regulatory work. And there's still a lot there's still a lot of work ahead of us on that. So we're still very much learning there.
Yeah, it's very new. I mean, a lot of people that I've talked to are aware but cautious.
Right.
It's very much in that kind of exploratory phase of like, what can this do? How could it support the population and also the board? And what are ways to implement it? And we're kind of feeling that out currently, to see the perfect example. Everyone likes to cling on to the chatbots, and it's like, yeah, that can be helpful. It can also, just from being involved with different boards, it's like most of the time when people want to ask questions or want to clarify things, they want to be heard, and it's hard to kind of, you know, the the resolution that they're looking for is hard to come by through just a, kind of a blanket answer, or here's the statute, follow this.
Right. Right.
They're
Right.
looking for somebody to kind of like walk them through it and support them, and really kind of hear what they're saying. And I'm like, I don't know how. I've always kind of wondered how AI would support that. I've actually been on calls with end users, and the support that they're looking for can kind of go past just like, yes, I understand what the regulation says, or I understand what the directions say, but I have a specific question, or I just maybe need to be heard, or some of that emotion is taken away through AI. It's strictly just, here's what it says, go do it.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the human element is very valuable,
Hmm.
especially when you're navigating, your path to your career.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the human element is very helpful and very valuable. The other note that I'll make in terms of AI and chatbots is, your response from that AI is only as good as the question you put in.
Yes.
So, there's that
Exactly. Yes,
too.
that is exactly correct. Yeah, such a good point there. So one thing I want to also talk to you about is I do know that most all agencies and boards are pretty much 100% fee funded, and so where do you see the trends on that with the standards for licensure? I mean, I one of the ways I can think about it is, if you're lowering it and you're making it too easy, isn't that taking away from the funds that the agency or board could be using to support the safety, professionalism of the community? Is that a threat, or I just think about like, well, if they're funded through people paying their fees, and if you lower that significantly, aren't you kind of just taking money away from a board that's overseeing this, and that's their duty within the community to make sure that those people are safe and qualified?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, you're right. In many cases, or in most cases, the licensing boards are self-funded, and what that means is they use the funds that they collect through their licensing programs
Mm-hmm.
to run their businesses or to run that business.
Mm-hmm.
And so in many cases, state governments will say, well, it costs so much to regulate this profession. Well, that isn't necessarily the case, because the state itself is not funding the operation of that board. The individuals who are licensed in that jurisdiction pay fees, and those fees
Yep.
go to fund the operation of the board. So I think that's a little bit of a piece that sometimes gets misstated or exaggerated. And when we talk about, reducing licensing will save the state money and it will, do all these great things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So, I don't think that is necessarily true, that reducing licensing is going to save states, tons of money and that sort of thing. Just basically the way that the licensing boards are structured within the system. As far as weakening licensing requirements and its impact on the board, I think that it actually could overwhelm the board. If you
Mm-hmm.
have individuals within a particular jurisdiction that are practicing that maybe shouldn't be, then you begin to have, more significant, complaint issues, or, more disciplinary action that needs to be taken. And, that can create, burden on boards. But from a financial standpoint, whether, the individual is licensed, through initial licensure application with the board or through a reciprocal licensure application for the board, they would have to go through that process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, and then so I wanted to ask you next, what can the public or others do to better support protection? If you're part of the licensee population, is there anything that they can do to obviously they have their own agency and they can make sure that they're qualified, but is there anything that they can do to better support the board or the community that's overseeing this? I mean, you know, I don't know. I guess I think everybody's on board that you want, physicians, dentists, um, contractors, any of these professional licensees, um, to be qualified. Is there anything that the general public can do or to support or, um, I mean, I
Well,
guess they, yeah.
again, I guess my recommendation would be to, look at, the professional licensing boards within your state. Are there positions available? If there are, go through the, whatever process there may be, to, put your name in the hat to serve.
Hmm.
I mean, it's a great learning opportunity. It's a great opportunity to get more, knowledgeable about the licensing systems and processes that are in place, that are there, specifically for public protection. So that would be my recommendation for how the general public could get involved. As I mentioned, before coming into the regulatory world, I had no idea that there were
Yeah,
licensing boards out there
totally.
that were there specifically to protect my interests, and that were there should I be harmed, that I would have recourse, and recourse
Hmm.
outside of litigation. That
Hmm.
is extremely daunting, and
Yes.
very expensive to go through a litigation process. So licensing boards are there so that the public has recourse should they ever be harmed, and to set standards in place so that hopefully harm doesn't occur.
Hmm.
So, getting involved, serving on a licensing board, and we can do a better job, within the regulatory community of really promoting those opportunities to the public, so that they're aware that they exist.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really valuable. Absolutely. Um, okay. Well, I mean that kind of wraps up my questions. Kind of the last thing I wanted to ask you is what are you guys working on that's coming out in the future, or do you guys have any events or any other, I thought this study was really insightful and I loved reading about it. Are you working on anything or have anything in the works that we can be looking forward to that's coming out? Any other studies or events?
Well, ARPL will continue to be vigilant in our efforts to promote responsible professional licensing through additional research. We'll continue to educate the public on, the need for licensing, why it's important, and really begin to focus our efforts on helping the public better understand the role of licensing boards and the vital public protection role that they play. Again, I just encourage you and all your listeners to follow us at the ARPL on social
Awesome.
media, and to visit our website at responsiblelicensing.org regularly, because we are that will be the first place that new research, new resources, new
Mhm.
educational materials will be available on the website.
Awesome. Definitely. Yeah, it is a wealth of knowledge. And I appreciate you jumping on, Veronica, and look forward to all the stuff that's coming out, and yeah, I'll be checking up on that.
Great, Sam. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you so much.
Have a
I
great
will.
day.
You too.